Marc Andreessen, thank you for making time out of your busy schedule and joining us in what has been a wonderful series of discussions, but I've not been more excited for any than this one today.
Thanks, Bruce. It's great to be with you.
So, you have this extraordinary career. You've been inventing the future for a couple of decades. You've been financing the future for a while, and I think that's awesome. The only piece that fries me is you're also writing about the future in ways that I can only aspire to. I know I can't code like you, but I wish I could write like you. 2011, you wrote Software is Eating the World, which was such an awesome vision of both where we are and where we're going, and it feels like you nailed it. I'm interested in three things. Do you think you got it right? Do you feel like the trend is a net positive and remaining net positive? And then I feel like we're amidst backlashes against both globalization and against big tech. And how do you see those intersecting with software eating the world?
Yeah. So let me start with basically a description of why I think why I think it makes sense to focus on software eating the world, having a big impact. So look, the Industrial Revolution has been running for coming on something like 300 years, and it's the foundation of basically our civilization, our society, and all of the wealth and prosperity that we've experienced over the last few centuries. Responsible for the standard of living of people today, which is way in excess of what it was 300 years ago. This is like the steam engine and electricity and railroads and manufacturing and cars and so forth. The primary area of innovation has been around atoms, like historically, right? It's been about kind of manipulating atoms, manipulating energy, manipulating steel and glass and rubber and stone and things like this. Over the last basically 50 or 60 years, we have this new kind of technology, which is digital technology, right? Which is software. Software is the manipulation of bits. The great thing about the manipulation of bits is that you can do that in a way that's totally unconstrained from the real world, from the practical world. And so, for example, you can change software at like just a much faster pace, than you can change anything that's hardware based. And then software is drafting on the back of Moore's law, right? Which is chips and computers keep getting faster and cheaper all the time because of all the work done in the chip industry. And so we basically have this new kind of technology, software. It's sort of, the way I think about it is it's a combination of science and art, right? There's a science to it, which is it's a little bit like building a bridge, but there's an art to it, which is it's also a little bit like writing a novel. We have increasingly the ability to apply software into all kinds of real world domains. Increasingly software coders can write software on a computer, they press enter, and the real world actually changes according to the software. Right, a classic example of this would have been the ride-sharing services like Lyft and Uber. The programmers at Lyft and Uber changed the code, press enter, and all of a sudden, drivers and riders all over the world are actually reconfiguring and moving around in different ways. So the way I think about it is like software is a lever on the real world. Software is a way to improve and change and upgrade, right, and alter, for better or for worse. But I think largely for better. The real world, and then it has this cornucopia kind of aspect to it, which is there's an infinite amount of software that can be written. Many people can learn how to write software. Many people are learning how to write software today, and so it's a field that is very easy to enter. Kids these days are starting to get trained on this. Starting at age 8, 9, 10. By the time they graduate high school, they sort of have the equivalent of a computer science degree in a lot of cases. And so it has been the center of kind of human ingenuity and creativity for the last 30 years, and I think it will probably continue to be for a long time to come.
And when you say software, I hear the internet is part of the software eating the world trend as opposed to separate. Look, I find that convincing. It's a bit like the Gutenberg printing press. Of course, that led to some pretty serious disruption of, organized religion, empires and democracy, scientific revolution and enlightenment. Any reason that this revolution isn't going to have at least as profound an impact?
Well, I was raised in the Midwest, so I try to be humble, and so it's hard for me to say that something that I work on, is going to have as big an impact with the printing press. But I'm almost into this 30 years now. A lot of people other than me are working on this stuff, so I'll try to sort of park the Midwestern humility for a moment. I think so. I think it's a change on that order of magnitude. It may be a change bigger than the printing press, and again that sounds audacious, but I'll make sort of the simple observation that there are a lot more people in the world today than there were when the printing press came out 500 years ago. And there are a lot more people who are interacting with computers much more quickly now, right, than we're interacting with written material. 500 years ago, like to get people to interact with a book, you had to teach them to read. right? They had a real chicken and egg problem in those days, right? Which is like, if there's no books, there's no reason to read, right? And so first they had to teach people to read, then they actually had to print books, which was very expensive. Then they had to distribute the books, and then and then everybody had one book, and then at some point they had to, which was the Bible, and then at some point they had to figure out the next book. And so the printing press had this kind of long ramp up period that had all of these, caused all these societal changes, or let's say contributed to all of these societal changes. Look, software is just hitting a lot more broadly throughout the world. A lot more people are interacting with it. Actually, you don't even have to be literate to interact with software, right? One of the sort of very interesting kind of phenomena is you have people, various people in the world who, you have people in the world who do not to this day have access to running water, do not have access to, stable sources of electricity, and have smartphones and have internet connections, and are able to watch, YouTube videos. And they might not even be fully literate, right? Now, by the way, being online, I think that also drives literacy. And so I think that problem kind of solves itself. But look, you can interact with software completely in video form, completely in audio form. You don't even need to read and write in order to do it. And so the pervasiveness of the technology seems much broader. It seems to apply to more domains of human activity than, even than writing did. And then I kind of pull back for a second and kind of say, there's a long conversation to be had about what the actual impact of the printing press was, and cause and effect and so forth. And it gets complicated. But one of the things that I think is very clear, kind of to your underlying question, is technology changes society. Technology changes the ordering of society. Technology changes basically the power structure of society. Technology, kind of shifts power from one place to another. The classic example of the printing press was shifting power from the Catholic Church to the kind of to the new Protestant movements, which were enabled by the the printing of the Bible. I think there's no question that today's technology, including all the software I talk about, is reordering power, reordering status, reordering authority. And one of the things we know about human beings is we are very sensitive to power, status, and authority. And we get very excited when we're gaining it, and we get very angry when we're losing it. And I think that dynamic does characterize a fair amount of the response that's happening right now.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Before we go more into the future, you mentioned the past, and I'd love to go back 30 years. Mosaic browser launched so much of the internet revolution in enabling people to interact with it and with each other. But you have 30 years now to see what went on. And some people are talking about Web3 is sort of a return. If you had to do all over again, knowing everything you know now, what would you have done, if anything, different back in '94? Obviously, you were limited by the technology then, and we still are today. But do you feel like, knowing everything we know now, something should have been baked in the beginning that's different?
Yeah, so there's something really important and we actually knew this in the beginning. We knew we had this problem. We didn't know how to fix it. We never figured out a fix. I'll describe what that is. So the big breakthrough of the internet, right? There were data networks before the internet. There were online services before the internet. Like the internet didn't create the idea of networking, but the internet was the first architecture for networking that had a characteristic that we refer to as permissionless. And permissionless actually applied at two levels. One is basically anybody could connect to the internet. Any individual, any consumer, any business, anybody can start an internet company. Anybody could connect to the internet. There was no previous network that had that property, and this is the underlying reason why the internet grew so fast. And then the other aspect of permissionless was anybody could build what we now today call an app, right? Anybody could build an app, an online service, a website, a program of any kind, and those apps could do anything. And as a consequence, you had literally millions of apps, kind of getting built all over the place. All prior networks had not had that characteristic. They had required some level of permission approval to build apps. Therefore, most apps were not allowed. The internet was the opposite. Anybody could build an app. Every conceivable app got built. And that wave continues. Kids all over the world are trying to figure out new apps, today. That was an enormously productive wave of innovation that resulted in Amazon and eBay and all of the Google and Facebook and all of the incredible services that people today use every day. So it was permissionless in those two respects. A consequence of the fact that it was permissionless also meant, however, that it basically didn't have an architecture of trust. It didn't have an architecture. For example, the internet has never had an architecture basically validated identity, right? And so, who exactly are you dealing with on the other end of the line? The internet was kind of explicitly designed where you don't necessarily know that, and again, you don't necessarily quote unquote want to know that because you want anybody to be able to connect and do whatever they want. But if you want to establish a business relationship online, if you want to be able to, sign a contract online, if you want to be able to, have sort of an ongoing business relationship, you kind of have to ad hoc springboard into that. There's no internet native concept of identity or trust. And then there's no internet native concept of money. And we've overlaid money on the internet in the form of we have credit card gateways and PayPal and things like that. So there's e-commerce for sure, but the concept of money is not built into the internet itself. As a consequence, the concept of economic incentives is not built into the internet, and that has led to all kinds of sort of pathological behavior. For example, spam. Right. The reason we have spam is because it's incredibly cheap to send a billion emails, even though it's incredibly expensive for people to filter through a billion spam messages. Suppose we had money built into the internet up front. Suppose we'd had a way to charge a hundredth of a cent per email message that was sent. Right. And then in that case, you could have made spam basically economically, impossible from the very beginning. You never would have had that problem. The consumer internet today is, famously primarily built around advertising. There's all these huge disputes over the kinds of business models that result from advertising. Again, that was a consequence of there was no micropayments to the internet. You couldn't charge people a tenth of a penny for visiting a web page. So basically, no trust, no identity, no money. And the short version of what's happening now that we're very excited about is now we finally have the technologies in the form of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and blockchain to be able to basically, we think, sweep in after the fact and basically fix that and basically insert those capabilities into the internet.
So having introduced DeFi and Web3, what do you see going on with crypto right now? Because it looks kind of volatile, and it seems like it's tracking the most volatile end of tech as opposed to a store of wealth or a calmer part of the market.
Yeah. Well, so the first thing is, look, this is this kind of technology change, like the internet itself, like the computer, by the way, like electricity, right, like television. This is a generational change, right? The big changes in technology happen over generations, and they're quite literally over generations, because basically you need basically a generation of kids to grow up who are kind of native in the technology in order to be able to kind of have society be able to kind of fully recalibrate around it. And so, look, the internet was invented effectively in the 1970s. It didn't really get consumerized until the early 1990s. It didn't, become a mainstream business medium for another probably 15 years after that. The world I live in is a funny world, because on the one hand, it feels like everything is moving so fast, right? There's all these, new ideas and all these, fired up kids and everything, and it seems like everything's happening overnight. And then at the same time, it's like, oh, well, that took 25 years, right? I'll give you an example. The smartphone, the smartphone, the first smartphone commercially shipped in 1982, right? And you didn't get your iPhone until 2007, right? And so it's like 25. It literally took 25 years to get the thing to the form where Steve Jobs could put an iPhone in your hand and you'd be like, wow, that makes sense. So the internet took that long, smartphones took that long, PCs, the idea of personal computing, took a full 20, 25 years to happen. We're still kind of in that middle zone. Cryptocurrency is basically, as a concept, new since 2009. We're about 13 years in. The serious commercialization work has only happened over the last 7 or 8 years. It's spread really fast, sort of from a standing start, but it's not universal yet. And so I think we're still relatively early. What is happening today, and this is where we get very excited, is many of the world's smartest entrepreneurs and engineers are now entering the space, right? And so you've had, like, basically over the last 5 years, you've had an entire generation of kids at top technical universities around the world who have been basically trained up in this technology. They've now entered the industry. Many of the smartest of them have basically gone into this as a career path. They are starting companies. They are building products. And we always argue with the press about this, because the press, basically every story is basically like, here's all the things that are wrong with the new technology, therefore it's stupid and bad. And what we always point out is, if you're a young entrepreneurial kid or an engineer, you look at that list and you're like, wow, those are all the opportunities to build products and start companies, right? And so you basically have this incredible talent rush coming in. And so any given critique that anybody has for this technology is being basically responded to by the entrepreneurial ecosystem. We believe, we're putting our money where our mouth is. We believe that, therefore, that generation of talent and that generation of new products and companies is going to make everything that I talk about a reality. A lot of work yet to be done on the way there.
All right. Well, that belief fits my vision of you. Is Noah Smith and a few other people are the king techno optimists that I know. I'd love to. We could all use doses of optimism these days. How do you see technology innovation, whether Web3 or otherwise, solving some of the biggest challenges that are out there? And three that leap to mind, which this is tough, but you do tough things: climate, cyber, and inequality. Like, how do you see technology helping to attack and solve those challenges?
Yeah. Well, so they're very, very, very different characteristics. So the easy one we can just talk about is sort of cyber, by which I assume you mean like cybersecurity, cyber attacks, cyber There were threats. Like that's just the consequence of that's just the consequence of any new technology, which is criminals and bad guys try to take advantage of it. One of my favorite movies is Public Enemies, which is Michael Mann's movie about Dillinger, right? And so there was famously this bank robbery. There was this national bank robbery wave in the 1920s, 1930s that led, among other things, to the creation of the FBI. Why was that a big deal at the time? It's because the Dillinger and his sort of fellow bank robbers at the time seized on the two new technologies of that time, right, which are automobiles on the one hand, and then basically modern weapons, the machine guns on the other hand, right? The car had kind of gotten invented and deployed in the 1910s, 1920s, and then the World War I veterans kind of brought back the Tommy gun. Dillinger and his crime gang, picked that up, and they, ran around all over the place and shot up all the banks and stole all the money and, did all the stuff that they did. And then at some point, literally J. Edgar Hoover, right, was like appointed and basically told, like, go fix this, right? Go fix bank crime or, car crime, in those days. And, the system adapted. So I think that's just kind of a natural push and pull. The other two are much more complicated. So I'll just give you my thumbnail sketch on both of these, and then you can decide how deep you want to dig in. So climate. So the problem with climate from a Silicon Valley perspective, and I should say there are a lot of smart people in Silicon Valley and the tech industry that are working on different aspects of climate. So there's a lot of effort going into it. But the main problem I have is we actually have the silver bullet technology answer to climate change, and we simply refuse to deploy it. And it's nuclear power. And so I was just looking, some fun trivia fact for a political dinner party, right? Is basically like how many new nuclear power plants, right, have been authorized, right, to be built in the United States over the last 50 years, right? And there's some quibble over like nuclear reactor versus plant, whatever, but the answer basically rounds to zero. If you look at the chart of nuclear power generation in the U.S., there was this big ramp up in the 50s and 60s, and then it basically flatlined by the 80s and has not budged since. And we're actually decommissioning nuclear reactors today, right? We've decommissioned major reactors in California and Michigan and New York, right, heading into a major energy crisis, which is just about the most self-destructive thing I can imagine. And we're just doing it because, like, that seems like was a good idea, I guess. And so we literally have a zero emission, right, electrical generation that's almost, and nuclear power from a safety standpoint, right, is like by far the safest form of energy that mankind's ever invented. It's incredibly safe. The total global death toll from nuclear power over the last 50 years is like 4 people in construction accidents, right? I mean, even Fukushima is responsible for 0 deaths, right? And so we have this
a high count. Chernobyl
was a military reactor. So Chernobyl was different. Chernobyl was a military reactor, and Chernobyl was a military reactor famously run by, they made a mini series about this. Let's just say a famously corrupt and inept government. But yeah, that was specifically a military reactor. There's been no civilian reactor. There's been no reactor used for power generation that's ever caused any problem anywhere near on that scale. And there have been lots of scares over the years, right? And we have this like imprinted kind of feeling that like 3 Mile Island must have been a big deal or something. And you go back and against like basically 0 deaths, Fukushima 0 deaths. And so we have this incredibly safe form of power generation. We could build 1,000 new nuclear plants. Oh, well, here's the other thing is all the nuclear plants we have running in the US now, they're like 40, 50, 60 years old, right? Like if we design new nuclear plants from scratch with the technology we have today, and deploy them, all throughout the Southwest, and basically use them to power up the electrical grid, and then cut over all the internal combustion cars to electric cars, which all of a sudden we could because we'd have unlimited electricity. All of a sudden you basically whack emissions very close to zero, for industrial production. And so we have this. We choose not to do it. I have all these friends working on like nuclear fusion, right? They're going to have, this idea of, basically this new form of nuclear generation called fusion, which is how the sun works, harness that and do it. And that's going to be the fix. And my answer to that is like, they're never going to let you build it, right? Like like we will have nuclear fusion reactors in the next 10 years or something. We will know how to do it. They're making progress on it. They'll never be allowed to build one in the United States. Like it's inconceivable that they'll get regulatory approval to ever do that. And so we're choosing. Well, in fact, I'll even tell you how dumb things have gotten. You're probably aware of this. Like we have tariffs on imported solar panels. Like we are so enthusiastic about fixing the climate crisis. We want to move to solar, and then we're putting these punitive tariffs on the imports of solar panels. Like so like when push comes to shove, like what's important to us, like it's definitely not climate. And so it's hard for me to get fired up about backing, basically new startups that are going to go after this solution when there's existing technologies that aren't being allowed to deploy. I don't know why I would expect that any of the new stuff that I would do would be allowed to actually happen. So there's that. Inequality is probably an even longer discussion. I guess I would quibble with the formulation of the question. I think equality is an evil concept. I think the 20th century proved definitively that equality is an evil concept. So the idea that inequality is a problem, I think, is just basically a misconstrued conception. Put it this way, I would not want to live in a world in which we decided equality was the goal. So I will opt out of claiming that I have an answer to that problem.
Got it. And I couldn't agree more on the outcomes, though opportunity. I do feel like one of the things that I worry about in the software eating the world environment is those with more education, those with more skills, those with more access to capital have a lead, and their lead is growing. And I sometimes, I go back to in American history, a last big change of the progressive era following the Gilded Age, when you also had technology and immigration. And one of the great innovations there was high school, where we made publicly available new ways to learn the skills to be more involved. I would have thought things such as teaching coding in middle school and high school would be ways to get at the inequality of opportunity challenge. But you correctly point out that we don't want equality of outcome, or else there's no chance to dare great things and do great things.
Well, let me propose two kind of constructive answers then to your point. So one is, look, software is one of the most democratic technologies ever invented in terms of people's ability to pick it up and learn how to do it. And it just, like, think about this in comparison. Suppose I want to be a civil engineer, right? Suppose I'm 10 years old somewhere in the world. I want to be a civil engineer. I want to build bridges, right? Like, I don't get to start building bridges when I'm 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 or 30. Like, I have to go get a PhD in civil engineering. I have to go do all these things. And then, maybe in my 40s, 50s, 60s, if I have super specialized expertise, I get to build my first bridge, right? Or dam or building or anything else like that, right? Or a nuclear plant, which I'll never be allowed to build. Right. Whereas software, like, literally kids all over the world are just picking it up. They're just picking up and doing it. In some cases, it's actual organized education in the form of there's all these nonprofits like code.org that are doing this. And it's, in a lot of cases, kids are just teaching themselves. Like, we get kids all the time who come in and, start companies and work at our companies where they grew up in, all these very remote locations, rural villages, dirt floors, very, very, which not normally the kind of background you look for people doing, kind of white collar work. And they basically have developed a skill level, in software development that is, in many cases better than people who've been through the top technical universities. And so there is a very kind of democratizing thing that's happening, because and again, it goes back to this permissionless thing. It goes back to the fact that this isn't a physical medium. It goes back to the fact you don't need to get anybody's approval. You can just go online, you can learn how to code. It's great. So look, not everybody's going to do that. Not everybody can do that, but it's far more democratic than any form of technology we've had. The other thing on sort of the equality concept is we always tend to think in these conversations in terms of human beings as producers, right? And so it's always kind of related back to jobs and professions, and that's important. But there is the other side to it, which is sort of the consumer side, right? Which is like, what are the goods and services that are available for us to buy, right? And the way to think about it is basically there's two ways to have an increased standard of living, right? One is as a producer to be able to garner higher wages. Right. But the other way is as a consumer for the products and services that you buy to get cheaper. And so one of the things that technology, and in particular now software, clearly does is when it sort of invades an industry sector that hasn't had it historically, it drives prices down very quickly. And look, you see that today online. You go online today on the internet today, and there's unlimited free video and music, and but kind of every books and content and everything under the sun. Anything information based, like, prices have just fallen through the floor. Right, and then I think there are real potentials to apply technology to be able to do the same thing in fields like education and healthcare, in the decades ahead. And I'll put it this way: if you were running an existing industry, and if you wanted to push prices down, right? And it's a question of whether a lot of existing industries want that to happen. But if you wanted that to happen, if you wanted consumers to be better off because you want to push prices down, or if you're a government and you want to push prices down to make people better off, you would apply as much software as you possibly could. And so that's the other thing that's happening. People are getting a lot better off as a consequence of the productivity gains from computers and software.
All right, so that's actually a great segue over to the American Dynamism Project, something you guys have launched. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but Catherine Boyle's interview with Noah Smith is so good. Good luck trying to compete with that. So what you were just describing is the application of software to historically less productive and innovative sectors. I mean, defense is pretty innovative, although I don't know that the dollar per whatever is going down. It feels like costs go up. But is American Dynamism Project, in your mind, more about let's apply software to a sector that needs it, or is it more about let's give back as a venture firm to try to help the nation tackle the challenge of supply chains that aren't resilient and too dependent, say, on China?
Yeah, so there's in American Dynamism is sort of it's an investment program that we have, but it's also kind of a movement that we're trying to kind of inspire people. So I would say there's kind of two layers. So one is there's sort of an underlying philosophical layer, right? Which is we used to be a society that basically valued and prioritized and gloried in building things, right? And causing new things to happen, right? And so we, the Manhattan Project, which helped win World War II, the Apollo Project, which, sort of was this crowning achievement of American civilization, Western civilization at the time, the Hoover Dam, the Golden Gate Bridge, nuclear power plants, like on and on, skyscrapers, like, there was a time when skyscrapers were like, just one of the most amazing things people had ever seen. There's this great line. There's great lines from the TV show Mad Men. It's there's one of the older secretaries in the office passes away in the office, and everybody doesn't quite know how to deal with it. And Bert Cooper, who runs the ad agency, says, he's writing her obituary, and he says, she was born in a barn, and she was born in a barn, and she died in a rocket ship. Right, and the rocket ship being like a New York skyscraper, right? And by the way, all other things, the national highway system, right? The national, the telegraph system, so forth and so on. Like this used to be kind of the defining characteristic of like American culture, American civilization, is that we would build all these things, and we prided ourselves on that we were the best in the world at it. And there has been this turn in the culture and in the environment, in the last 50 years, where we decided that most of that is bad. Right. Most of that is bad in some way. Most of that is bad, evil. It's bad for the environment. It's bad for this. It's bad for that. It's bad for inequality. It's bad for whatever are all the different reasons we feel bad about everything. And so we've decided we don't want to do those things anymore. And so part of it basically is an attempt to basically say, no, actually, those things were good. The sort of philosophy of actually building things. Industrial production is a good in and of itself, because it actually, it makes the world better. It makes people's lives better. It makes the country better. And then very specifically on top of that, it's like you have these sectors of the economy, and Catherine in particular is very focused, my partner Catherine is very focused in particular on kind of these intersection points between business and government, where you've got basically these functions that the government sort of purports to provide, right? Basically says they're going to provide, and then basically spends, enormous amounts of money, and then maybe you get them and maybe you don't, right? And maybe you kind of get what you want, maybe you don't. Right, to your point on national defense, maybe you get the Joint Strike Fighter program for, that's a decade late and $300 billion or whatever, and maybe it's useful in a conflict like Ukraine. Maybe it's actually completely useless, right? Maybe aircraft carriers, are aircraft carriers useful at all in a world of hypersonic weapons, right? Like, like if you just look at like the kind of war that's happening on the ground in Ukraine, like it seems like there's like an entirely new kind of war unfolding that has a lot more to do with like miniaturized electronics and software and information than it has to do with all these big weapons platforms. The U.S. defense industry has no intention of adapting, right? The big monies and all the big programs. And so, so a big push we have actually under American Dynamism is actually to build new primary defense companies, new primary defense contractors. And, a great example we talk about a lot is Andreessen, right? Which has been, and kind of in the news a lot for being, for basically being a new direct, competitor to incumbents like Lockheed and Raytheon. Another one I'll highlight, just another example of company is, in theory, our government provides law enforcement, right? For some reason, there's this like massive nationwide, basically crime, spike that's, particularly, hitting low income neighborhoods. This follows, probably completely coincidentally on the basis of this huge push to defund the police. For some reason, there's a heated dispute in American politics as to whether defunding the police causes crime to rise. Apparently, this is like open to argument. I would not have thought that it was, but it is. And so we have this company called Flock Safety that basically is this new way for law enforcement to wire up all of the public cameras, in a town or city, and basically be able to solve crimes with software. And so, and literally, it's like child kidnapping, a car gets carjacked, kids in the back seat. Where's the car right now? Right? How can I search the entire city? And by the way, even if they go to another city, how can I search that city? And how can I find that car and get the kids back? It's actually really kind of entertaining in a sort of a weird kind of morbid way, which is the more the more local municipalities, including a lot of the most progressive ones, cut their police forces and cut their police budgets, the more money they have to spend on technology to solve all the crime that results. Would I prefer to live in a world in which we have to build new technology to solve crimes? Maybe not. Do we live in that world? Like, apparently we do. Can the tech industry actually help with that? Yes, we can.
All right, so you referenced, well, you inadvertently referenced your It's Time to Build, another of the great Andreessen essays. For those who haven't read the assembled works, it's on the website of Andreessen Horowitz. It's awesome, but you talk about building is kind of a historic and important element of American culture, and something else that I wonder about. Although I wonder if it's only a temporary 50, 60 years ago, which is the most trusted person in America in 1970 wasn't a builder or a government official or a business person. It was Walter Cronkite. It was the guy who read the news. Part of that was the luxury of there was not a lot of competition in three major news networks. They were trying to appeal to the whole nation because they weren't at risk of anybody picking off niche sub markets. There are thousands of channels these days, and so to compete for the eyeballs, media has gone more if it bleeds, it leads, more extreme. And social media likewise is built based on you need engagement to get advertising eyeballs. How do you see the impact of the incentives that exist within media, and how do you see technology perhaps adjusting those incentives to maybe make media a little bit less the cause of why everybody thinks everything is terrible?
So, well, first of all, can I challenge the myth of Walter Cronkite?
Yeah, please.
People love a Walter Cronkite example. So the big example of Walter Cronkite, if you're the conventional history, it's like he became, well, let me ask you this. How did Walter Cronkite become the most trusted man in America? What was the moment? Remember this from the history?
I would either say Kennedy assassination or the moonshot.
No. And so both of those are important. He was there for
Vietnam?
both of those, Vietnam. So the conventional history, the conventional way the history is told us, it was the classic thing that led to, in part, LBJ not running for re-election in '68. It was the classic LBJ line was if Walter Cronkite Walter Cronkite turned on the Vietnam War in 1968. He became negative on the Vietnam War in 1968, and that caused LBJ to basically say, if we've lost Walter Cronkite, we've lost America. And that was the moment. Well, that begs a very interesting question about Walter Cronkite, which is, what was he saying before 1968? That was resulting in him apparently not being the most trusted man in America, right? And of course, we all know the answer to that, which is, of course, he, like everybody else, was pro the Vietnam War, because everybody was pro the Vietnam War, right, up until around that point, right? Kennedy got us into Vietnam, right? Johnson kept us there, 8 years before Nixon came in, 10 years before Nixon came in, going way back. And so basically, the way I interpret that history is basically Walter Cronkite moved from the wrong side to the right side. And that quote unquote made him the most trusted man in America. Now, what that did was it made him the most trusted man in America on the one side, but not on the other side, right? The side that he left behind certainly did not consider him the most trusted man in America. I tell you, where I grew up, he was certainly not considered the most trusted man in America. And of course, and again, if you kind of read the history all the way through, you could argue that that's what led to the rise of, characters like Rush Limbaugh, right? Sort of talk radio, right? This completely new kind of, basically media ecosystem on the other side of the divide. And of course, everybody good and proper is on one side of that divide, and everybody sort of bad and backwards is on the other side of that divide. And, who writes the histories? It's the people who are on the good side of that divide. I actually think, look, social media is new in many ways. One of the ways that it's very much not new, like for sure, is the idea that it's like creating political polarization somehow, right? Or that it's causing people to basically have divergent views, or that it's causing people to basically disagree more, or like any of those things. Like the only people who think that there wasn't this level of active disagreement in American politics and society before social media were basically on one side, and were just blind to what was happening on the other side. There, by the way, are some outstanding books on this idea. I'll give you one in particular that I just love. One of my favorite books I've ever read. There's a book called Infamous Scribblers. And it's this guy, Eric Burns. They wrote this incredible history of what American journalism and public debate was like during the American colonial era in the 1760s, 1770s. And this is, the famous era. Ben Franklin is a newspaper publisher, and like all in the Federalist Papers, and like all this stuff that was happening, back then that led to the American Revolution, right? That actually led to the formation of the country. And if you read this book, basically what you'll do a double take, and you'll be like, oh my God, they were just like us. Specifically, oh my God, the media landscape in 1770 was almost exactly like the media landscape today. It was incredibly fragmented. You had all of these incredibly crazy voices all over the place. You had all these incredibly intense partisan political debates. By the way, many of the most interesting debates actually took place under pseudonyms. right? And so I'll give you an example. So Ben Franklin. So in those days, newspapers were all local because they didn't have distribution technologies yet to make like a national newspaper. So they're all local newspapers, and the only people in a position to print newspapers were the actual commercial printers. So if you the way you got in the newspaper business those days was you owned a printing press because you were a commercial printer, and then you just started like publishing a newspaper, and you just started being the guy who would just kind of try to tell everybody else what to think. That's how Ben Franklin entered politics. Is he started as a commercial printer, he launched a newspaper, and then he ultimately ended up being Ben Franklin. When he was a newspaper publisher in this era, he wrote under pseudonyms because in those days it was very dangerous to write under your real name. You might get hanged. And in fact, but he also had to sell newspapers, and so he wrote under 15 different pseudonyms. And then in order to sell papers, he would actually have his pseudonyms like get into these vicious fights, where they would like viciously attack each other and call each other like horrible names and like make all these like claims towards each other. This culminated in the election of 1800, which famously was the Jefferson-Adams election, in which literally both sides owned newspapers to be able to attack each other and spread all kinds of like incredibly vicious like personal attacks and personal rumors. And so anyway, so if you go back to that era, like it's just crystal clear, basically how that happened. That was the media landscape, basically. Oh, and actually, if you go even further back, that was also the first newspaper. The first newspaper was actually printed off the Gutenberg printing press. It was a Vatican scandal sheet. It was a Vatican tabloid, and it was like they got in huge trouble at the time because again, it specialized in like all these rumors, innuendo, and saying all these awful things about the senior clergy. And so this has been the media landscape for a long time. We went through a period of 30 or 40 years of kind of broadcast TV and national newspapers, in which I would argue we had kind of an artificial suppression of sort of volatility and variance. We basically had this era in which you could kind of, like, if you really wanted to, you could pretend that there were only 3 or 4 or 5, people kind of worth listening to, and they kind of had the right points of view. The population at large never bought that. They never believed that. Like the people on the other side basically never bought that. And now it's all basically reverting to its historical norm. And so I actually find what's happening, like for better or for worse, what's happening now is actually the sort of normal state of affairs.
Ezra Klein wrote Why We're Polarized, which is a short read that's excellent, and it likewise got into exactly what you were saying, to the point of lots of newspapers, the Arizona Republican, like a lot of newspapers had Republican or Democrat in their title, and that it was only this brief period when you could reach the entire state or the entire nation that you started aiming at the available market, and the refragmentation has led to folks saying things that please some and displease others. So,
well, if I could, what Ezra, but it's worth considering what Ezra means by polarized, right? What does Ezra mean by polarized? Ezra means they don't all agree with me, right? Ezra means like they're not all doing what I want, right? So polarization. Who's in favor of less depolarization? The people who are winning, right? Who's in favor of more polarization? The people who are losing, right? The people who feel cut out. Let me give you one more book recommendation. So I don't think depolarization is a goal. In fact, I think we need to get personal view. We need to get a lot more polarized. I'm in favor of sharply increasing polarization. Let me give you one more book. Martin Gurry.
I'm in the middle of it.
Yeah,
Revolt of the Public. So good.
Revolt of the Public.
So good.
The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority. And Martin's this very interesting guy. He's a friend of mine. If you've seen the movie 3 Days of the Condor, the Robert Redford played it. Basically this guy who worked for an arm of the CIA, where his job was to read everything. And then basically his job was to like discern political changes by basically like reading everything ever written in the 1970s. That was literally Martin's job at the CIA. Like he was that guy. And so his whole life basically has been trying to understand basically political change, social change, basically what causes revolutions. And his big conclusion after a life in the CIA basically was it's this dynamic. It's exactly what we're talking about. And in particular, it's the extent to which, he calls it the Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority. It's the extent to which authority figures have imposed a point of view on the population at large, and maybe even convinced themselves that the population at large agree with that point of view. And then it turns out the population at large very much does not agree. And then the resulting crisis, right? Now, by the way, if you're like a dictator, like this is a big problem. Like you very much don't want this to happen. By the way, if you're Ezra Klein, you very much don't want this to happen. But if the argument that Martin unfolds is very interesting, which is a lot of people have a lot of point of view on a lot of the way that existing authority figures are actually running the world, and they look at it and they're like not that pleased by it, and they don't think it's going all that great, and they maybe don't believe what authorities are saying. And by the way, maybe the authority figures don't deserve to be believed, right? Like maybe they're actually not very good at what they do, right? Like, the argument could basically be the problem with elites in our society is not that they're elites, it's that they're terrible elites. Like they're really, really, really bad at what they do. And then basically the argument that Martin unfolds is the big breakthrough of social media is that it lets people actually say that out loud, right? You no longer just have to like sit in your living room and like complain to your friends and basically there's nothing you can do about this because the entire national media is coming at you with basically what you think is a fake view. All of a sudden you have a way to respond. And anyway, at the very least, I think it's an argument worth reading at length.
I'm absolutely loving that book. Gurry is so interesting, and that he wrote it in 2014 in particular, pre-Trump, pre all this stuff is amazing. To me, though, my take on it is less that the elites are all terrible as much as the notion of elites was that they knew more than everybody else and that they were wiser than everybody else. And it's the radical transparency of the internet that demonstrates that they're only marginally, they just spend a little bit more time in the space, but they're just as likely to make mistakes. You know, look at the CDC, don't wear masks, wear masks. And so part of the problem is they're falling from a pedestal. And, you know, on your polarized point, I mean, I as with before, I totally get what you're saying. You know, we need people more invested and to care more. At the same time, you know, obviously, if everybody thinks every election's a Flight 93 election, I worry that you got to be able to lose an election and reformulate your policies and try to win the next one, as opposed to, you know, feeling like there is no longer term. But I'd love to ask you, if I can, about a recent, you tweeted in response, there was a Wall Street Journal story. The title was Disney's Clash with Florida Florida has CEOs on high alert. And you tweeted, tip of an iceberg the size of Mars. And it makes me, you had talked about sort of the where traditionally things were, and traditionally business leaders, you know, the old Michael Jordan line, like Republicans buy sneakers too. You know, there was an attempt and a desire to represent everyone. You're seeing, in part, with younger employees who want their CEOs to be more engaged in issues. My own observation is it feels like we went from maybe a little bit under-involved to probably over-involved, but I'm interested in your tip of the iceberg, you know, what you had in mind. And I'll note it's 4:41. We'll go like 4 more minutes here. I promised 45, and I like to try to keep to it.
Even though you just asked me the question that makes me take my shoe off and pound it on the table and give the full 6-hour Khrushchev speech. So I'll try to do the short version. Yeah. So look, the short version is American business basically knew every credible, competent American business leader for the last 100 years, basically leading up to about 10 years ago. You know, the one thing you all got trained on that you all knew was basically companies do not get involved in partisan politics, like they and these kind of big social questions, like they just don't do it. And they don't do it for a whole variety of reasons. They don't do it because they have employees that have many different points of view, right? They don't want to, like, you know, alienate half their employee base. They have customers with many different points of view. And then it's just like, it's an invitation to basically just get like embroiled in politics and to have the, you know, opposing political party just try to, like, you know, damage you, right? Actually take action against you. And why would you do that? And then that gets to the other problem with it. And again, this is the thing that CEOs do for 100 years, which is you are, as the CEO of a public company, you are not the principal, you are an agent, right? You do not own the company, right? You're a manager of the company. The owners of the company are dispersed. You know, they're all over the place by definition, like your stocks and pension funds. You know, you've got, you know, big American companies have literally millions of individual shareholders. Your job is to optimize primarily the retirement money for you know, for Americans writ large. I mean, that's effectively what the way the public American public market works. Your job is to represent this very dispersed shareholder base. This very dispersed shareholder base, of course, has very dispersed views on all these issues. And this idea, you know, any competent CEO 30, 40, 50 years ago would have said this idea that I am, as an agent of these shareholders, am going to basically abscond with company resources in order to prosecute a partisan political agenda using the resources of the company, which is like obviously unethical. And by the way, like pretty illegal, like not really allowed. Like you're not allowed as an agent on, you know, a fiduciary agent on behalf of shareholders, you're not allowed to pursue your own personal agendas with company resources, right? And if you like, you know, if you like put your girlfriend in the company airplane, like you get in real trouble, right? And that's the reason why. And this is an even more vivid example of that dynamic, in my view. And so something basically happened, right? Something snapped, and now you have a generation of CEOs who've decided that it's actually just fine to do this, and in fact, it's what they should be doing. And you have an entire generation of professional investors who are also agents and fiduciaries on, responsible for a very, you know, millions, in a lot of cases, billions of actual individual shareholders who decided that they're similarly going to mount up these political crusades and try to pressure companies into following them. And we've just decided, oh, this is just a great idea. Like let's just politically polarize everything. And I just think like what's built up here, I mean, this has all kinds of negative effects on the culture of these companies and how they're operating internally. And we can talk about that. But this is building up a backlog of like liability, of like real like liability, like political, legal, like regulatory liability. I don't know if these companies will ever get called on it, but one could imagine political regimes coming into power over the next 20 or 30 years that have a very different point of view on this than the ones we've had historically, that have a really big problem with public companies getting politically polarized this way. And the revenge that could get wreaked against these companies could be cosmic. I hope that doesn't happen, but the way that they're acting right now, like they're certainly asking for it.
Yeah, my impression is you'll see companies probably backtrack a little bit in the statements and in the getting in the middle of political debates, but I bet you won't, and I kind of hope you don't see companies back off of things such as providing benefits to their employees. If you believe if you believe in LGBTQ, provide benefits to your employees for, same-sex couples, great. Weighing in on every policy fight is where it feels like they're at risk. I'm going to ask you just a couple of lightning rounds in the end here. Who do you read that you find that you're excited each week to see in your inbox?
So I kind of have a cheat code for current stuff, which is I get to talk to the principals directly, and it's mostly founders, and so mostly I don't read like current analysis. Mostly what I do is talk to the people who are actually directly involved in the domain. And so quite honestly, most of my actual kind of current information is coming from people who are working in all these fields. Most of what I read is history. Most of what I read is history generally, and what I generally find is the further back I go, the sort of more useful it gets. And the reason I say that is basically my view on these things. We talked a little bit about a couple of these things before, but it's basically like there's this incredible temptation. There's this incredible temptation to say something new is happening in human behavior, something new is happening in technology, and so therefore the technology change must be caused the change in human behavior. What I find is those arguments are almost all ahistorical. I talked about this with political polarization, but you can apply this to almost all these other kind of questions we're talking about, which is almost always the human behavior that's involved is human behavior that's been actually a perpetual thing. It's been in evidence. Human beings have not changed. Or we're still running we're still running the same DNA, right, software. That our ancestors were 200 and 1,000 and 5,000 years ago. And so, human behavior like really doesn't change. And so if you go back far enough in history and you get out of the heat of all the current issues and you see the same human behaviors playing out, and you see them playing out, way before current technology was invented, like I said, with, like the media landscape of the colonial era, for example, well, then whatever's happening today is clearly not being caused by today's technology. Clearly it's fundamental human behavior. It may be getting influenced by what's happening with technology today, but it's not being caused by it, right? Because it previously existed. And so what I've been trying to do for the last few years is kind of do the historical deep dive and try to get at those broader patterns. And again, like basically what I find is the further back you go, the easier this gets, because you kind of have to get out of the heat of all the current issues. You have to kind of get yourself in historical periods where people aren't angry anymore. And then you can kind of look at it with like an appropriate level of emotional detachment. You can say, oh, that's why they got this huge fight, right? And it won't be news to you. People get in fights, like people argue. People have all kinds of disputes, and so that's where I get that's what I get mostly from reading.
Well, that makes me happy to know, as both a history major in college way back when, but somebody who enjoys history. And what I agree with you particularly on is anytime, if you look at contemporaneous reports, people always think things are bad and things used to be better. And then you kind of have a little bit of time and distance in history. And I tend to believe that thanks to the work that you do and other innovators out there and around the country do, and the great work of the venture industry broadly, we're living in the greatest time in human history. There are more opportunities to be healthier, to live longer, to create more, to be more advanced. There's a lot that we can fix, but boy, a lot's going right. And I think you and your company are responsible for a lot. So Marc, I really appreciate your making time today. This was awesome. Thank you. Thanks to all the folks who tuned in, and have a great day.
Good. Thank you, Bruce.